Welcome to this campus conversation on defining resilience and defining post-traumatic growth. Let's begin with resilience. Quoting the American Psychological Association definition, resilience is the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or even significant sources of threat. Defining resilience, this is, according to the APA, bouncing back from difficult experiences. COVID-19, of course, the global pandemic. Can we bounce back in some way? Absence of PTSD. This is resilience. In the context of psychological trauma, we've experienced great adversity. COVID-19, other kinds of traumas you may have experienced. We may go on to develop PTSD and other mental health problems. We may not. And in fact, in this course, we've learned that most, despite adversity, will not go on to develop serious mental health problems such as PTSD. In fact, then most people prove resilient. So resilience is really on one side of a pole where PTSD might be on the other. We can't really have both at once. They're really different outcomes. Resilience implies, in fact, the absence of serious psychopathology such as PTSD. Resilience is the ability to adapt, to quickly recover from adversity, return to baseline function following the experience of that adversity. This is how I'm doing right now. Then comes the trauma. Then comes the adversity. There may be a short dip, but quickly I come back to the level at which I was before the trauma. This is resilience. And we can measure resilience in various populations in response to various traumas, as we've said. COVID-19, combat stress in the military, various assaults experienced as an adult, perhaps sexually, perhaps physically, perhaps emotionally, or the experience of these kinds of events during childhood, all kinds of trauma we might experience. Now let's compare the notion of post-traumatic growth. Post-traumatic growth is perhaps linked to resilience in a certain way, but it is distinct nevertheless. Both resilience and post-traumatic growth are seen to be human strengths in the face of traumatic events. But post-traumatic growth involves a struggle for a period of time. There is the struggle in dealing with the trauma. As far as resilience, there was only that very brief dip, and then I'm back to baseline. Comparably, post-traumatic growth may involve a significant struggle for a period of time, coping with the trauma. But ultimately, post-traumatic growth is about being beyond the baseline. Subsequent to the trauma, now I'm operating at an even higher level of strength. Post-traumatic growth implies positive changes from the pre-trauma level of functioning, such that now I'm at a higher level of functioning even than before the trauma. And so, resilience and post-traumatic growth are linked, but really, post-traumatic growth is negatively correlated then with resilience. Whereas resilience was on the same sort of continuum with PTSD, but at opposite poles. Now, post-traumatic growth implies a whole nother axis, because we could have PTSD together with post-traumatic growth, in fact. PTSD implies the difficulties that we're experiencing post-trauma, but there also may be other areas, separate areas of growth, of positive function, even beyond the baseline, pre-traumatically. And so, post-traumatic growth is an individual's ability to experience positive psychological change following the negative impact of trauma and stressful life events. This post-traumatic growth involves developing increased appreciation for life, a greater sense of personal strength, self-understanding, renewed appreciation, perhaps for intimate relationships, and positive spiritual changes. When we're thinking about the relationship between PTSD and resilience, it really, as we've said, opposite ends of sort of the same dimension, perhaps. Clearly, a negative correlation between the two. Comparably, with post-traumatic growth and PTSD, we've suggested that perhaps it's independent. You can have both present, and some research is suggesting a curvy linear relationship, a sort of inverted U. Here, when we have very low PTSD, in fact, we might have low post-traumatic growth, because the implication is that the trauma may have not affected us significantly enough to develop the PTSD. Essentially, we've been resilient. And so then how can we go on to develop significantly in a positive direction as well? Essentially, the trauma didn't affect us significantly. We proved resilient. We didn't develop PTSD, but we similarly did not develop post-traumatic growth. At a moderate level of PTSD, there may be high post-traumatic growth. Nevertheless, some research also implies that post-traumatic growth is unlikely at very severe levels of PTSD. So, hence, the curvy linear inverted U relationship. So to conclude, resilience tends to be negatively correlated with PTSD, thought about two separate opposite ends of a continuum. Post-traumatic growth, in fact, this is negatively correlated with resilience, as would be implied with its relationship with PTSD, where there is a positive relationship, but perhaps it's curvy linear. Negative outcomes, these include PTSD following trauma. Positive outcomes, however, are also possible. Post-traumatic growth is also possible. These two outcomes, in fact, may coexist. And I thank you for joining me in this campus conversation in the hope that you're showing resilience, and perhaps despite this trauma, this global pandemic, you might also find the potential for post-traumatic growth.